contributes to inflation, which we all expect, I guess, more or less. Bernardo, what is exact time? I'm not. Well, maybe Nikki. What is it time? 8:10?
Yeah, actually 6:11 I have in my computer.
11. Oh, okay, all right. So mine is okay. It's probably time to begin. I would like to welcome everyone to the seminar of the Center for Institutional Studies at the HSC University. And tonight our speaker is Professor Nikki Shure from University of College of London. Nikki does labor education, gender economics. Her PhD is from the University of Oxford. I believe master's is from the same university, and bachelor is from Free University of Berlin. Her talk tonight is on intergenerational educational mobility to university, the role of non-cognitive skills. So, welcome.
Great. So I'll just share. Oh, I think I need to have screen sharing enabled. Sorry, I should have checked that before the.
All right. Well, Bernardo, can you grant the permission?
Oh, yep, he did.
Oh, you have it, right? Okay, it should be all right, I think. Usually it's not a problem. Okay.
Let me just enter.
Here we go. Yep. Excellent.
Here we go. Okay. Great. So thanks so much for inviting me, Bernardo and Leonid. So I'm going to be presenting some work that's still in progress, which is why I wanted to present this part of this project. But this is part of a bigger project that's funded by the Nuffield Foundation on first and family university graduates. And I'll explain what I mean by that during the talk. And I will talk about some other parts of the project because it has been, I think, an over 2-year project. And the Nuffield Foundation, for people who aren't familiar with it, is a charitable foundation in the UK that is very interested in things about inequality and education, hence why they decided to fund this project. And this is joint work with Morag Henderson and Anna Adames-Volgi, who are my colleagues at UCL. Okay, so I'll briefly provide some context for the specific paper and the project in general. I think probably everyone knows a lot of this stuff, so I won't spend too much time on it. But we know that higher education is something that brings a lot of benefits in many areas of life to people. So we could be talking about higher wages, better health outcomes, assortative mating, finding a better quote unquote partner, longer life, right? So there's a lot of evidence, some of it causal, some of it not, but there's a lot of evidence that it's beneficial. At the same time, we know that who goes to university is very graded by socioeconomic status. So people from more advantaged backgrounds are more likely to go. And that's been established in the US as well as in the UK. So I've put some references there from UK literature since we're going to be working with English data. But we know that who goes to university is very related to family background. What's interesting, though, as well, is that the returns to higher education are also heterogeneous by social background. So in some ways, the people who are least likely to go, if they are able to go, might gain the most. And so there is this also interest in getting people to get to realize those returns. And that's heterogeneous by social background as well. So the context for this big project that Nuffield Foundation is founding is basically we wanted to look at people who are first in family. So we call them fifth in this project. And so I will be referring to fifths a lot. Basically, those are going to be people who didn't have a parent who had a university degree. So neither parent, and in this case, we count step and biological parents, had a university degree, but they go on to achieve one. And I think part of the reason that we wanted to look at this group is that this is a very policy relevant group in England. So you can imagine that when people are applying to universities, this is considered a marker of disadvantage. So just like being eligible for free school meals is a marker of disadvantage, so is coming from a family where no parent has a university degree. What I think was really surprising for us, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the findings, I'll briefly talk about them here, but I'll talk a little bit more about other papers in the project, is that this is actually a really big group in England. So 2/3 of recent university graduates are actually the first in their family to go to university and achieve a degree. Obviously, we're only talking about the relationship to the parent generation. I should say that. So it doesn't matter. It might be that your older brother had gone to university as well, and then you go. For the purposes of what we're doing, we don't take that into account, partially because in the data, we don't observe, we wouldn't observe that. And also when people apply to universities, the university doesn't really care. They're interested in whether or not your parents went. I should also say, we have one colleague who loves to tell us that he's first in the family, but his grandmother had gone to university. That's very interesting. It's also very rare. We can actually look at that a little bit in the data. It's not reported for, well, we are able to look at that. It's very rare. So, and universities, again, they're only really interested in whether or not your parents went to university. Okay, so the other thing that's important to note is that when we're talking about potential first in family, so I'm going to refer to that group quite a lot as well. Those are people whose parents don't have university degrees, but they could go themselves to do a university degree. So those are people whose parents don't have a university degree. They're about half as likely to go to university as young people whose parents are graduates. So there is that difference in who's actually attending university by family background in a raw sense there. Okay, so just as a bit of more motivation, what does first in family status look like across the OECD? This is some data from PISA 2015. So these are people who are obviously not in university yet. They're age 15 when they're taking PISA, but they're saying what level of education do they expect to complete? And you can see the UK, I think if I move, people can see what can you see my mouse, anyone? I hope.
Yes, so
oh, good, okay. So this is the UK, and you can see that it's about what I will show you again in a moment. That's about 20, just under 20% of young people in the UK say that they want to be first in family. So basically their parents don't have a university degree, but they plan to go achieve one. Interestingly, you have countries like Germany where that's very, very low. And then you have some OECD countries that are significantly higher. Okay, so the previous work that we've done as part of this project was just to establish some descriptive evidence, because basically there wasn't any. That was part of the reason why we also wanted to start this project, is that no one had really looked at this group in a systematic way. So some people had done kind of small scale studies, lots of interview kind of experiences of people at university, but no kind of nationally representative analysis. So so we're looking at a cohort of people who are born 1989, 1990. And what we show in this work is that 18% of people born in those years end up becoming first in family university graduates. As I mentioned before, that is 2/3 of recent graduates. And then what we're also interested in is not, okay, you know, what is their proportion in the population, but what kind of courses do they make decisions? What kind of studies? Where do they study? And so what we're able to look at is the types of courses that they do. And we find that they're more likely to choose certain courses. So these are the labor force survey classifications. That's law, economics, and management grouped together. So they're more likely to study law, economics, and management, and they're less likely than their peers whose parents had university degrees to study other social sciences, arts and humanities, and medicine. So I think that that's kind of interesting when we think about, you know, what kind of, when someone's deciding to go to university and their parents hadn't been, maybe they're more attracted by fields that tend to have what could be perceived as a higher economic return. Interestingly, in the labor force survey, STEM is actually the category with the highest returns. So, but law, economics, and management is up there, and obviously that could be something where you think, you know, that's going to give a high return. We also find that they're more likely to attend less elite universities and to drop out. And so that is important as well, because we know that people who go to elite universities in the UK, and there we're talking about the Russell Group institutions, so these 24 kind of more research intensive, perceived to be elite, that includes Oxford and Cambridge. They're less likely to attend those elite universities, and then they're more likely to drop out, which we know is obviously associated with a lot worse life outcomes. So already there we see this picture of first and family students choosing different courses, choosing different types of institutions, and potentially also dropping out. What we also do in this project, which I think is quite interesting, is we are able to observe the labor market outcomes. So this cohort born in 1990. The last and most recent sweep of data was collected when they were age 25. And so these people are already in the labor market, or a lot of them are already in the labor market, because in the UK, an undergraduate degree is 3 years. And what we find in that paper, when we look at and obviously it's early career, but when we look at those labor market outcomes at age 25, we find that FIF women, so the women who are the first in their family to go to university and achieve a degree, earn 7% less than female peers whose parents already had university degrees and they achieve a degree. So they match their parents with a degree. And that gap is really robust and consistent, basically no matter what we control for in models, including prior attainment at very high stakes national exams that everyone has to take. That doesn't explain away that gap. And so that is, at age 25, there already is that 7% penalty, really, of kind of coming from a disadvantaged family background. And what we also find in that paper is that there is a gender wage gap at age 25 already. And it seems to be driven actually by the FIF gender wage gap. So FIF men are earning more than FIF women, and FIF women are really facing kind of this penalty. And so that's driving the gender wage gap that we already see at age 25. Okay, so that's just a brief overview of what we've already done on this project. And I think it's useful to keep in mind as I talk through what I'm going to show you today from this newer paper. So there is previous literature that's looking at the role of non-cognitive skills in several different kind of domains in life. So that could be educational attainment, labor market success, health. And I think there's some really good overview papers that look at lots of different aspects of this, whether we're talking about personality characteristics, motivation, attitude, effort, emotions, all of this stuff. For the purposes of this paper, and I think people, psychologists and economists, are making a lot of distinctions between, are we talking about skills or traits? There's been some work that's tried to establish that these are actually skills and not traits. So they are things that can be developed. And I think some of the things the things I'm going to be showing you, there have been interventions that can influence these skills. So in some ways, I think that's positive, because these are things that are malleable and we can try and, people could develop interventions to improve, as opposed to saying, this is a trait that you're born with and it's, unfortunately, that's the way it is. So I'm going to try and argue that these are skills. And I think from the discussion perspective, hopefully that maybe motivates people to think about that. So what we're doing then in this paper is linking, I think, these two strands of literature, what I previously told you about why, that there is this kind of gap in participation based on family background, and trying to understand, well, why is it that some people from this quote unquote disadvantaged background make it to university and others don't. And I think what is unique about this data, we have a lot of really rich measures of family background beyond just parental education. And we also have national tests that these people are all students in the UK have to take. So we have some really good prior attainment measures. And then what we also want to understand is whether non-cognitive skills play a role in intergenerational educational mobility to university. So now I'll tell you a bit about the data. So we're using a cohort study from England called Next Steps. And this data is housed, and actually in our department at UCL, we have the Center for Longitudinal Studies, which houses a range of what are called the British birth cohort studies. So this is technically not a birth cohort study because it was started by the Department for Education when they were age 13, but it is still a cohort study, and it has importantly been linked to administrative data on compulsory education exams. And that means it's been linked to the National Pupil Database. So in England, there is a census of every pupil where they have their national test scores recorded. And that's a really powerful thing to have, obviously, because you can compare students from all over England on these exams that they have to take. And so I think, yeah, that's a great thing about using these survey data, is that they're linked to this administrative data source. These young people that I'm going to be talking about, I've already mentioned, they're born 1989, 1990. The first wave, they're age 13, 14, and the most recent sweep around age 25, 26. So we know a lot about their adolescent individual characteristics, and that includes non-cognitive skills, which are going to be measured at age 13, 16, their family background, as I mentioned, their test scores, and whether or not they go to university. In the most recent sweep of data, there are about 8,000 individuals. Of course, as with any survey data, there's the usual problems of attrition and non-response, and I'm not going to go into it in this presentation, but we do try and do a lot of robustness checks to deal with this. We obviously use sample weights, but that is always a challenge when working with this kind of data. Okay, somehow I've clicked on, oh, there we go. Okay, so let me just make, yeah, is that the right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm now going to briefly talk about the non-cognitive skills that we use in this paper. So the first one is external locus of control. So this is something that captures whether or not you believe that your life outcomes are determined by external circumstances. So how much do you think that luck or faith are responsible for your life outcomes versus you yourself? And it's been shown that having high external locus of control is negatively associated with a lot of educational, behavioral, labor, and health outcomes. Because basically you're in some ways, it's kind of like you're thinking you're not taking responsibility for your own actions and outcomes. There is also internal locus of control, but in this paper, we're just focusing on external locus of control. And then I've put on, for each of the 4 constructs that we're looking at, I've put the actual survey questions so you can get an idea about how these measures are created. So basically you're asking, the young people are asked at around age 13 in the first wave, how much do you agree with the following statements? And of course they can go anywhere from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And you can see there's some things here that have to do with, if someone is not a success in life, it's usually their own fault. How well you get on in this world is mostly a matter of luck. So these kind of things, thinking about how much do you feel like you have agency or control over the outcomes in your life. The second skill we're going to be looking at is academic self-concept. So this is basically your perception of how good you are at school. And so this has been also shown to be positively associated with educational attainment in a range of different studies. So, how good do you think you are basically at school? As you can see here, one of the questions. So how good do you think you are, and how good or bad do you think you are at specific subjects? So we have quite detailed information about how you perceive yourself in a school context, and then also whether or not you think you get good marks for your work, your feelings about school. The third skill that we're going to look at in this paper is work ethic. And this is about, how hard do you perceive yourself? How hard do you think you work? I think what's interesting about this, we obviously in this data set, we don't have personality, but it has been shown, work ethic has been shown to be really related to conscientiousness, which is one of the big 5 personality inventory. And conscientiousness has been shown to be a really important non-cognitive construct in a lot of different literature and contexts. And so the fact that work ethic is closely related to conscientiousness, I think also indicates that it probably is also quite an important one. And this one is captured by asking how much, at school you work as hard as you can, working hard now will help me get on later in life, and how much doing well at school means to you. So that's work ethic. Then we look finally at self-esteem. So this is different than academic self-concept. This is about, so kind of unrelated to school. This is about your perception as a person and your own value there, and how you can kind of think of it as like how worthy or worthless of a person does the person answering these questions think they are. And this has also been shown along with some other measures to, having higher self-esteem, increasing the probability of going to a 4-year college, as well as increasing wages. So there is definitely some stuff has been established in the literature that self-esteem also matters for outcomes. And here you can see this is asked by how useful have you felt recently, and how much have you been thinking of yourself as a worthless person recently? So what I should say for this one, we only have the two components that go into creating self-esteem. So here we're going to be looking at low self-esteem. So if you put yourself in the lowest category at least once for either of these. For the other measures that I showed you, we're going to be constructing an index using a principal components analysis. So I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but it's a method basically to take these different sub measures and create an index that we can use in regressions, which we then standardize. And we have done some robustness checks about that, which I can speak about if we have time and people are interested. We also did some work to try and look at maybe kind of a composite index where we would combine different parts of the 4 different factors that I talked about, but it wasn't, I'm not going to present that because I don't think it's actually as interesting. I think these are kind of distinct constructs, and so thinking about them separately is a more useful approach. Okay, great. So what we're going to be doing in this paper is in some ways pretty straightforward and basic. We're going to be doing some regressions to predict university participation as our outcome among potential first and family. So remember, potential first and family are people whose parents did not go to university. So that's the whole sample of those young people. We obviously know who ended up going to university, but right now we just want to predict, and that's how we'll predict university participation, but we're going to be doing that in the whole sample of people whose parents don't have a university degree. Then we're going to do a Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition of the gap in university participation between the potential fifth and those people whose parents were graduates. Because as I mentioned before, there is a higher probability of going to university if your parents have a university degree. And so we want to see, well, how do these factors explain that gap between the two groups? Anytime I'm going to be showing you conditional estimates going forward, we are going to be controlling for things like gender, age, number of siblings, the region in which you went to school at age 13, whether or not you're a care leaver. So that means whether or not you lived in social care or in a foster care situation, low birth weight or born prematurely, your ethnicity, mother and father's social class, their age, and their highest qualification, obviously below university. Whether or not you grew up in a single parent household, a measure of income deprivation that's based on your neighborhood, whether or not you have a disability, as I mentioned before, whether or not your grandparents attended university, and then free school meal status, so whether or not you're in a low enough income to be receiving free meals at school, whether or not you go to a private school, and then, as I mentioned, those national test scores from age 11. So at age 11, everyone in England has to take this test, these tests called Key Stage 2, and we can control for their score on those tests. In some models that I will show you, we are also going to control for GCSEs, which are, again, a very high stakes test that everyone has to take at age 16. It used to actually be the compulsory school leaving exam before there was a reform for people to stay longer in school. And so we will, in some models, include those scores. Obviously, there's some issues here around that potentially being a bad control because this is on the pathway to university, and we think that probably the non-cognitive skills are already affecting that test score versus the age 11 test scores are taken before our skills are measured at age 13. So something I think to keep in mind. And just to refresh people's memory, I'll talk you through briefly again the groups that we're going to be talking about. So remember, there's the potential fifth. Those are the people whose parents don't have a university degree. That's that first column here. And then we have the children of graduate parents. So if either or both of your parents has a university degree, that means you're the child of graduate parents. And then we know if the young person themselves did not go to university, then you end up being those who match their parents with no higher education. And that's about 2,500 people in this sample. Or you could be downwardly mobile. So if your parents had a university degree and you don't, then you're downwardly mobile. That's about 450 people. Of the potential fifth, if you actually do go to university and achieve a degree, you become a first in family university graduate, about 1,100. And then of the people whose parents had graduate degrees, if you also end up going to get a university degree, you're matching your parents with higher education. So those are going to be the four groups. In some contexts, we'll just be talking about this column, and in some we'll be comparing everyone. So hopefully that will become clear. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just trying to get an idea about what the raw and conditional means of these non-cognitive skills look like. All of these measures have been standardized. So mean 0, standard deviation 1. If you're positive, that means you're above average, negative, below. And what we can take away here, I think, as the first, and so the dark is the raw means, and the light gray is the conditional means. And then this is grouped by those four categories that I just spoke about. So if you don't have higher education and your parents also didn't, if your parents had a graduate degree and you didn't, you're downwardly mobile. This is the fifth group, the upwardly mobile. So your parents didn't have a university degree, but you do. And then this is the group matching the parents with higher education. So the first takeaway is that in work ethic, academic self-concept, and self-esteem, the fifth group have the highest conditional skills in each graph. So fifth students, especially as compared, fifth students have the highest conditional means of these non-cognitive skills. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. They are also as compared, not in external locus of control, they are as compared to their peers whose parents had a university degree and they also go on to get one. They have higher work ethic, higher academic self-concept, and higher self-esteem. So what does that actually mean in terms of explaining university participation? So now we're thinking just about the potential fifth. So the people, so as I showed on this graph, what I should also, right, so the potential fifth could be, it's this group, so the people whose parents don't have higher education and they also don't, and this group, this is the upwardly mobile group. So in all of these graphs, the fifth have higher non-cognitive skills, also compared to their peers whose parents don't have a university degree. So we want to understand how important are these things for explaining the probability of them going to university. So the way this table is structured, you have in each column, the first four columns, each of these measures is entered independently while still controlling for all of the things that I previously mentioned. So gender, age, number of siblings, region. I've left some of the notes here on this slide. So all of those kind of predetermined background, family background, and some socioeconomic status measures. And so I'll talk you through each column. The first, or each model, the first one is showing that having a higher locus of control, external locus of control, one standard deviation higher, decreases the probability of going to university by about 7 percentage points. And again, that's in line with previous literature because external locus of control is about kind of not having agency over your outcomes. So thinking that it's due to faith or luck. And so that is kind of what we would expect. When we move on to work ethic, we see a positive coefficient. So 1 standard deviation increase in work ethic leads to about a 7% increase in the probability of going to university. Again, I think that's magnitude and sign is in line with previous literature that working harder is going to be important for attending university. And again, this is all, in all of these models, we already controlled for prior attainment. So we have key stage 2 performance in these models. So we're saying over and above prior attainment, how are these measures related to the probability of going to university? Academic self-concept, we also see a positive, about 11% percentage point coefficient for a 1 standard deviation increase in academic self-concept and the probability of going to university. And then remember, the low self-esteem is just classified as low self-esteem based on those two measures. And so we see there that having low self-esteem decreases the probability of going to university for people. This is only for people whose parents don't have a university degree. So we're trying to understand, why are some people able to make it to university when their parents don't have a university degree and some don't. And this is, of course, we're basically saying, we're looking at two people who have the same kind of prior attainment family background.
Clarification question, Nikki?
Yeah, sure.
So here you're separating the sample. So you have about 8,000 observations, but here just focusing on 3,000 observations or so. So that's because you are separating the sample for those children who neither parent has a university degree, right?
Yeah.
So what I've seen in the similar literature is that what is usually done is to interact these variables with the subgroups in order to have a pooled sample using the 8,000 observations, and then just have interactions with the subsamples of children with parents with the university degree or not. Have you tried to do that? Because here, when you're separating the samples, you're assuming these are drawn from a similar population, and that might not be true.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have done that, and I think, I can't remember why we switched, to be honest. That's a very good question. We have done it as interactions as well. Let me think about that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I have to think about it. I know we have done that when we first started this project. So I can't remember why we have switched. I think part of it was we just wanted to have, I think the results were not different, if I remember correctly. And the idea was, well, let's just look at, we just want to understand why some people from this potential fifth group will go on to become fifth. And in that sense, it makes it like kind of a cleaner story. But I take your point that it would be nice to see it also as an interaction.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Francisco, do you have a question? Sorry, I saw you unmuted yourself.
No, I just said thank you.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, you changed your background. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so that's looking at each of those traits individually. When we enter them all into one model in column 5, I think the main takeaway is the magnitudes change a bit, because they're now, in some ways, probably some of the things are related to each other, or that could be driving what's happening. But the direction is similar. So we still see that higher external locus of control is still going to be negatively related to university participation. Higher work ethic is going to be positively related. Again, higher academic self-concept, so how you view yourself at school, and lower self-esteem also negatively related to the probability of going to university. In column 6, we're then adding in the GCSE, so the kind of really high stakes tests that these kids are doing at age 16. So that's going to be after these measures of non-cognitive skills are collected. And what we see there is that only work ethic and academic self-concept remain robust after we've taken into account this other measure of attainment, which of course could be picking up, I think in some ways it's a less clean way to do it, because we're not sure what those GCSE scores could be picking up on the pathway to university, that like how these non-cognitive skills impact those GCSE outcomes, I think is going to be really important. And we will, if there's time, we can talk about that as well. We've done some stuff to look at how these measures impact performance at GCSE to try and understand that pathway a little bit better. Okay. I think what's also interesting, so in that sample, what I just showed you, right, that's all of the potential fifths, all the people whose parents don't have a university degree. But we also want to think about, okay, well, how does this look across the ability or attainment distribution by test score quintiles? So here we've just broken the sample now into the your quintile on key stage 2 performance. So that measure, that test that's taken at age 11. So, and then estimated that same model 5, the model with all of the non-cognitive skills at the same time, but in each quintile separately. And I think the main takeaway here is that academic self-concept seems to matter across the whole attainment distribution. The magnitude gets smaller as you go up towards the highest quintile, but it still remains positive and significant. There's that external locus of control only in the middle quintile. I mean, statistically significant, but the magnitude is negative across the distribution. And the low self-esteem only seems to matter at the top of the attainment distribution, which I think is kind of interesting. We can come back to that point when I show you some of the gender stuff, thinking about how low self-esteem might actually only really be harmful for people who are really high achieving. So I think it's interesting to think about, you know, how does this happen? How does this affect individuals across their performance on the distribution? Okay, so before I get into any of the gender results, here we're now going to look at the decomposition of the gap. So in university participation, comparing people who are potential fifth versus those with graduate parents. So this is maybe getting to Francisco's question a little bit better, which is thinking about how, you know, in the whole sample, why is it that children of graduate parents we know are a lot more likely to go to university versus those whose people whose parents don't have a university degree, and how can we explain, or how if we decompose that gap, how important are these non-cognitive measures? So we do this for the whole sample, and then we do it for boys and girls as well. And so what you can see here is, right, those differences in the probability of university participation for children of graduate parents versus the potential fifth. That's what I told you before. There's this really big difference in the probabilities. So it's about, right, 50% higher, essentially, for the group 1. The difference between those two groups is 30 percentage points. And then we have the explained part and the unexplained part. And so, right, we're thinking about the explained part being due to what's called in the literature sometimes endowments, and that can explain about 60% of the difference, right? This is about 60% of that difference. I've only showed you a table here where we've already grouped things together to make it a little bit more, I think, intuitive, but I think the main takeaway is that when we look at, for example, at this parents coefficient, so this is putting together things about the parents, other highest qualifications, social class, age, the kind of things that I mentioned previously as controls, that explains about 27% of the gap. The key stage 2 tests, those are those tests at age 11, explain about 7%. And then academic self-concept explains about 10%. And external locus of control about 3%. So there's actually seemed to be, especially for academic self-concept, seems to be quite an important explanatory factor in kind of figuring out, decomposing this gap between those two groups. And I think that's in line with previous literature that's highlighted the academic self-concept and how you view yourself in school is actually quite an important thing. When we look at the gender differences, I think the main takeaway is that academic self-concept measure is more important for boys in explaining the gap than it is for girls. So that's about 13% of that gap can be explained by academic self-concept. And for girls, it's more like 7%. So there is some interesting stuff here, I think, about how, how boys view themselves in school and how important that is then for explaining that socioeconomic gap in university participation. So keeping in line with the gender gaps, we've now looked at, or now we'll look at this kind of how these skills differ first by gender in terms of a gap, and then how these look at some heterogeneous effects of these non-cognitive skills for boys and girls by including a gender interaction. So first, when we look at the gender gap in non-cognitive skills, these are all, you can think about these coefficients as being kind of coming from a regression where that's the coefficient on females. So a positive value would mean that girls have a higher, for example, external locus of control or higher work ethic. So if it's above 0, girls are higher. And if it's below 0, girls have a lower value. So as compared to boys. And then that's, again, these are the same groups. This upwardly mobile group, so the third group on all of these graphs is that first in family group. So the main takeaway here, I guess, is that there's no significant gender gap in the external locus of control group for any of those groups. That those gender gaps are not significant, but there are some significant gender gaps in other measures, specifically when we look at so in work ethic for the fifth group, and then also in self-esteem and academic self-concept. So girls tend to have lower academic self-concept, both in terms of raw gaps and even when we condition on characteristics and prior attainment at age 11. So girls also have lower self-esteem. I think this is also in line with a lot of previous literature that's found that women are more likely to rate themselves or evaluate themselves negatively. So you could think about that being related to academic self-concept, similar for self-esteem. Okay, so now these are the same potential fifth models that I showed you before, but now we're including a gender interaction term. So the idea now is to think about, well, we saw that there were some important roles that the non-cognitive skills played in predicting who made it to university, but now we want to understand how is this different for boys and girls. So in the first column, we can see that having a higher external locus of control if you are a girl has an even larger negative effect on the probability of participating in university. When we look at work ethic, there is no differential effect for girls versus boys. So work ethic is positive. We can remember that from before, but it's not differential by gender. In column 3, when we look at academic self-concept, we actually see that academic self-concept is more important for boys. So you can see there's that negative heterogeneous effect for girls. And remember, that's in line with what I showed you from the full sample on from the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition, showing you that academic self-concept explained more of that gap for boys than it did for girls. So I think that's kind of in line with what we see here. And then in the fourth column, low self-esteem. Again, low self-esteem is harmful for the probability of going to university, but it's not different for boys or girls. And when we put them all in with the full interactions, the only ones that remain statistically significant in terms of heterogeneous effects are, again, the external locus of control, similar magnitude, and again, the academic self-concept, similar magnitude again. So kind of an unsurprising result there. And then this is the model, again, the final column, where we're controlling for those really important test scores at age 16. And again, I would say the results are pretty similar. So there do seem to be some gender differences in terms of how these traits matter. So I'll wrap up, just remind everyone what some of the conclusions were from this paper. So we find that non-cognitive skills matter in intergenerational educational mobility. So when we're looking at people who go to university, that was that first graph that I showed you with the four different groups. If we compare fifth young people to their peers whose parents had university degrees, but they also go on to get them, fifth young people possess the highest non-cognitive skills. And that's true even in the conditional sense. So even when we control for lots of things about their background, they have the highest non-cognitive skills. And that might be part of the story about why they're able to make it to university. When we look at the group of potential fifths, so young people whose parents don't have a university degree, the non-cognitive skills also matter there. And there it seems like work ethic and academic self-concept are important for everyone, which I think in some ways is really intuitive, but they're actually especially important for boys. And I think that's an interesting finding from this project. And this is, of course, remember, we're not just talking about boys across the entire population. We're talking about boys from a more disadvantaged background where your parents don't have a university degree. We also find in those models that low self-esteem harms only those at the top of the ability distribution. And that was true for boys and girls. I didn't show you those tables, but we did the same by attainment quintile. We did the same models with interaction terms for gender. And I think in the grand scheme of things, a lot of this stuff is actually good news, since non-cognitive skills are malleable, and there have been interventions that have been found to help young people develop these things, specifically things like academic self-concept and work ethic. And so, in some ways, I think if we think that these are important factors for helping young people get to university and then also succeed while they're there, that's something that can be worked on in a pretty concrete way. Although, and I didn't go into a lot of detail on this in this presentation, of course, the disadvantage that we're seeing as a result of family background is actually being realized in test scores pretty early on. So anything that people are doing to increase university attendance among this kind of potential fifth group are probably happening too late if they're doing them towards the end of or after right when secondary education is ending. And so the more I've worked on this project and we're thinking about university participation kind of being this important end goal, the more I realize you need to be doing stuff a lot earlier in terms of intervening. So I think that's an important takeaway. Any interventions that are going to be working to develop these skills definitely have to be happening earlier than the end of secondary school. Great. So thanks so much for listening to this presentation. And I'm really happy if people want to get in touch after the seminar, of course, as well, or obviously now in the discussion. I'm really happy to take any questions by email.
Okay, very good, Nikki. Thanks very much. We still have about 10 minutes time for discussion, Q&As before it has to go. So if there are any questions, please.
May I start?
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Nikki, for the presentation. It's a very interesting project. My first question is just out of curiosity, and I mean, it's not probably directly related to the project, but so you said at the beginning that 2/3 of graduates are like first in the family in England, which yeah, I was quite surprised. I found it like quite a large number. And so I'm wondering are you aware of any studies like complementary to yours that could show whether these first in the family graduates have contributed to reduce like intergenerational inequality or not?
That's a good question. I know, so I'm also doing some stuff on intergenerational income mobility, comparing two cohorts in the UK. So one born 1970 and then this one born 1990. Yeah, I mean, there is some stuff could be obviously, so higher education has expanded. That's part, I mean, the part of this story is that higher education, there's been a big expansion. So there's more universities in England and more courses. And so that's why more people are able to attend. That is taken into account, I think, definitely in some work in this area. But I need to think more about specific studies. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I think it is something that people are thinking about in this literature, especially when they're doing comparisons over time.
Because my understanding is that like overall inequality, I think it has been increasing or at least stable in the UK, but I don't recall it to be decreasing to the best of my knowledge, at least.
Yeah, so we have a new paper that we're working on this exact topic. So looking at how sons' earnings are related to their father's earnings, comparing this cohort born in 1990 to 1970. And part of that is obviously affected by education. We're still working on that, so I can't tell you the results yet. But yeah, I think you're right that is a really important factor in these kind of comparisons.
And one more question, which is related to one of the conclusions that you said, that these non-cognitive skills are malleable. So of course, if you would like to increase the attendance of first in the family, like I guess there's might be some policies that can contribute to this. My question related to the expansion in higher education in the UK is like, do you know if there's kind of spare capacity in higher education? Like if like some people who are not going to university could go, or if like all places are taken, then it's kind of a zero-sum game that in order for more spheres in the family, the people to attend, then you need to kick someone out.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't, so I don't personally know that. I think part of the reason is that UCAS, so for people who don't know the UK system or the English system that well, everyone applies centrally to universities. So, you apply, you can only list 5 courses. And so in theory, we could look at that because we could look at, if we had access to UCAS data, we could get data on all applications and then we could find out where people ended up matching. And if it was a question of, there just not being capacity. There are also caps on student numbers. So universities have to have a limit on the number of students that they can take. So I don't know this for sure. My guess would be that there are people who end up not getting in, but that could also be because they're applying, you can only apply to 5 courses. So it could also, I mean, well, there's this thing called clearing at the end, but I don't want to go into too much into detail. But I think, yeah, it could be the case that people are not getting onto courses. And you're right, then it could be that you have people from disadvantaged backgrounds not. Unfortunately, this data hasn't been linked to the application data, and it would be really cool if it was, because we could see, are there people who are applying and then just not getting in? But we don't know that.
Okay, well, we have tight deadline, which is in less than 10 minutes. So let's see if there are any other questions people want to ask. Any comments? Any feedback?
I have one more question,
Sure.
but I think Francisco.
Sure. Sorry, Bernardo, let's give a shake to others if there is any demand, and then if there is none, you will have your question, if you please. Francisco?
Just a quick question. So there are still many unobservable factors which are not controlled in this type of progressions and related to culture, norms, values inside households that might affect both cognitive skills and outcomes, school outcomes. So one of the things that are commonly used in the literature are family fixed effects, taking differences between brothers in order to explore a less biased effect. And usually once you include family fixed effects, most of OLS effects tend to go lower. Have you tried to do that, or have you talked on including this?
So we haven't, for a couple of reasons. One, this data set doesn't have data on siblings. So if you're in the sampling frame, it's just you. Like, we know how many siblings you have, but we don't have any information about the siblings. So we wouldn't be able to do a family fixed effects approach because there's only one observation per family in the data. The other issue with using, I think, a sibling fixed effect approach or a family fixed effect approach here is that there are going to be issues, right? If you're the older sibling, being the first to go to university might be even like a bigger barrier, which we're kind of abstracting from here. We know birth order and we're controlling for that, but I'm not sure that it would entirely get around all of the unobservable issues. But yeah, I think it's worth, we can't, the short answer is we can't do it in this data because it's one observation per family. But I would need to think more about if it would really, like, obviously I'm not trying to claim that any of this stuff is causal, right? We're trying to decompose gaps and think about, we observe these gaps and kind of what contributes to decreasing them. But of course it is not causal, and there's a lot of unobserved stuff here. I mean, I think the advantage of this data is that it's very rich and we have a lot of information. So if you buy, as much as you can kind of selection on unobservables, I think this is pretty good. Of course, it's not ever going to get around that completely.
Okay. And so yeah, probably family fixed effects are not possible. Just the other option could be sort of interactive fixed effects, such as order of birth times age, or these kind of fixed effects that could also bring more control to this type of regression.
Yeah, I mean, I think order of birth is a really important one because, yeah, if you're the oldest sibling and you go to university, it was a lot harder for you to do that for the younger sibling because they've already had you kind of as a role model. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, we are controlling for it. Obviously, we're not interacting it with being fifth, but it could be something interesting to explore for sure.
Thank you.
Very good. Let's see. Anyone else? Good news is that actually we have about 10 minutes more smaller than I thought we do. So Bernardo, if you still want to ask a question.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
sorry, can I keep bothering you
Yeah, sure.
with questions? So if I remember correctly, at the beginning, you mentioned that these first in family also were, so like more likely to attend less selective universities.
Yeah.
And more likely to drop out.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious about, so if I understand correctly, like in the data, you would treat equally like a student who didn't enter to higher education versus someone who entered but dropped out, because like none of them got a degree in the end.
Yeah. When we're yeah.
So I mean, I would be interested to see more differences between the two groups, because I think it's different as someone who I either didn't want to enter or couldn't enter versus someone who managed to enter but couldn't finish.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't looked at that stuff in a really long time in terms of the dropout stuff. So I would need to go back and look at what the actual sample size is there. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting because, you know, why would you start? These are also people, I should say, who are starting university before the tuition fees were increased in England. So university was cheaper, you know, just as a side point. So, you know, a dropout is still like a big decision to do. Like you started university, it costs money, you decide not to do it. But yeah, they are different than people who didn't start at all, for sure. I'm not sure how many people it is actually, but I'll have a look at that actually. That's interesting, thanks.
Yeah, because I don't know if it's like a 50-50 of dropouts and who didn't enter, then I think, yes, different story versus just a negligible portion of dropouts.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Sergey Popov has a question, please, Sergey.
Thanks. I wanted to ask a little bit more about maybe data you have, maybe data that you're gonna have. And the reason why I wanted to go into that is because schools, high schools, you know, the secondary schools, right, are very important for students when they decide whether to pursue the higher education, and if they pursue the higher education, which one to go for. And they are important for two reasons. Number one, there is a counselor or two that help students decide which 5 universities to apply to, right? And if you have a parent who graduated from Cambridge and the counselor tells a child that he needs to apply to like Hull, right? There will be a resistance, right? Counselors are also maximizing their utility, and they find it easier to sell Hull to people who don't know why Hull is different from Cambridge, right?
Yeah.
And the second thing is that schools are, well, I don't know how much you keep track of the news last year, but because of the COVID, they had to cancel the proper A levels, and they had to give out marks based upon the historic marks of the schools, which, I mean, is totally crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like, look at the proportion of first classes and give exactly the same proportion of first classes, no matter what's the performance of students, right? But it's not just last year when that, you know, stickiness to when, you know, educational authorities wanted to impose some sort of the great stickiness into the system. They do that all the time anyway. So I guess my point is, imagine, I don't know, a taxi driver who is a refugee from Afghanistan and his child is graduating from the school, right? There are 3 children with the same performance, right? One of them has to get a B. Who is going to get a B?
Yeah.
What will they feel about, you know, external people influencing their decisions more than they influence their decisions themselves?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think the school point is really good. I didn't mention this, but so in these models, we didn't include school fixed effects. We have run all these models with school fixed effects as well. And the results don't.
I don't think you have a lot of students from the same school.
Exactly. So it does, you can do it. I don't think it's actually that sensible because there's not, by the time you get to this point in the sampling frame, you don't have that many, exactly, you say you don't have that many students per school. You can do it. And I was surprised to see that the results didn't change that much. I don't think, I think partially that's because people are selecting into schools based on prior attainment, and we actually were controlling for that. So that might explain why the results weren't that different. I don't think it's really a good idea to do when you're using next steps in certain contexts. So we didn't do it here. I agree with you though. I think schools are really, really important. And also in terms of peer effects, like you say, the counselors and the teachers who work there, Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess, yeah, I'm not that keen to do the school fixed effect approach when using next steps, because I think, as you say, there's a small number of observations. Beyond that, it's hard with this data, I think, to do much, though. There isn't going to be good information on counselors or peers, really, because we don't have enough observations per school.
As for UCAS data, I know UCAS sells their data. If you have the money from the grant or something, they're happy to negotiate with you on that. We tried to get it for free. We spent about 3 years, and then the place that wanted to facilitate that collapsed. So at the end of the day, I've got a lot of trainings about how to use data, and I have no data. So good news is that data exists. Bad news, it might need some money to get it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thanks. That's
okay, no, anyone else, please? Any other questions, comments? Nikki, if I may, I was intrigued by you saying that fifths less often choose STEM for their university studies. They do law, economics, management. Is this because STEM requires some specific cognitive skills that kids are more likely to acquire if they grow up in families with parents with university education?
So they're not less likely to do STEM, they're less likely to do other social sciences, arts and humanities, and medicine. All
right, so STEM is not actually.
So STEM is not, yeah.
Right?
STEM is the highest labor market return subject, but they're not less likely to do it, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to see if non-cognitive skills are still essential for choosing different disciplines once you control for fifths? In other words, you take the community of fifths, or you take a dummy for being a fifth person, and then interact this dummy with cognitive skills, non-cognitive skills. I see what the likelihood is of choosing different fields. You know,
definitely. We did not do that in that paper. In that paper, we did not look at any of the non-cognitive measures. We did control for prior attainment. I don't think we interacted it. I don't remember. But I think you're right that it could be related to how you, like, why you choose certain subjects, especially since we're looking at things like work ethic and academic self-concept. I'm not sure how they would be related to one subject versus another. It is possible maybe that, you know, STEM subjects require different levels of work ethic or academic self-concept, but I'm not sure based on prior literature if there is like a strong reason to believe that. I'm not sure.
And one more, if I may, non-cognitive skills, great non-cognitive skills give kids greater confidence in their ability to pursue university education. Yeah. And if someone is from a family with parents with no university education, you might have something extra to jump over this hurdle to be the first. So would that be the case? Is there any way to measure this or establish this?
I mean, yeah, I think ultimately, I think that's kind of what we're trying to do in that in the decomposition is to say, like, exactly like you say, there is this gap. We think part of it is, I mean, we don't know it. There's lots of things driving that gap. I agree with you. I think a big part of it is going to be related to confidence and lack of knowledge. Like you just don't have that in your parents to look to. Of course, it could also be picking up things about socioeconomic economic disadvantage, which we've shown in some other work. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately that's what we do want to say, that this is kind of like an important way to overcome that hurdle. But yeah, I'm not, yeah, I think it is. And I think ultimately it's some of the stuff that I showed in the decomposition. I think that's what that's getting at.
All right, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Let me see if there's anything further. The speaker really has to go in a few minutes. So
yeah, sorry.
If there is nothing further, all that remains to be done is to thank Nikki so much for extremely thought-provoking presentation. We've learned a great deal, and we look forward to hopefully staying in touch. And Nikki kindly invited further questions and comments by using email. So let's make sure we use this opportunity. And Bernard, the conventional, please tell us what's coming up next. And we'll wrap up.
Yes, well, thanks, Nikki, once more for accepting the invitation. We were very happy to have you today online. And well, we have next week Marko Vladisavljevic. Sorry if I probably slaughtered his surname. And he's going to present his paper on the child penalty in Russia, evidence from an event study. So that's going to be next Thursday, same place, same time. So we hope to have you all here. And yeah, have a good evening and a good weekend coming soon.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much to
everyone.
everyone. Have a good evening and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.